The crystal chandelier in the foyer cast a flawless glow over the anniversary gala, masking the scent of unfamiliar jasmine perfume clinging to Julian's bespoke tuxedo. Clara smiled for the flashing cameras, her hand resting perfectly on his arm, even as she felt the cold, hard edges of the burner phone hidden deep within her clutch. It was the picture of a perfect Seattle tech royalty marriage, hiding a betrayal so profound it was about to erase her entirely. If the quiet shattering of a perfect illusion speaks to you, stay with me. There are much darker truths hidden behind these mahogany doors, and you won't want to miss how the pieces fall. The rain in Seattle always felt less like weather and more like an architectural feature, a constant heavy sheet of gray glass pressing against the city. Inside the soaring atrium of the Seattle Art Museum, however, the climate was strictly controlled, smelling of expensive orchids, ozone, and wealth. Clara Vance stood near a towering bronze sculpture, a flute of untouched champagne warming in her hand. She wore a slip dress of midnight blue silk that clung perfectly to her frame, the very image of the stabilizing, elegant force behind Julian Vance's chaotic tech genius. Across the room, Julian was holding court. He had that effortless, boyish charm that made venture capitalists open their checkbooks and tech journalists write glowing profiles. He was laughing, one hand tucked casually into the pocket of his tailored Tom Ford trousers, the other gesturing broadly as he spoke to the mayor. Clara smiled softly from a distance. A photographer from Seattle Met snapped a picture of her looking at her husband, the devoted wife. The caption would likely read, "The anchor of the Vance Empire." A slight headache pulsed behind her right eye. She set the champagne down on a passing waiter's tray and moved toward the coat check. Julian had complained about a mild migraine earlier in the car and mentioned he had Advil in the inner pocket of his suit jacket, which he had checked upon arrival to switch into a more formal tuxedo blazer for the speeches. "Mrs. Vance," the attendant said, rushing to retrieve the garment bag. "Just need something from the pocket, thank you." Clara murmured, her voice a low, soothing cadence. She slid her hand into the dark silk lining of Julian's everyday jacket. Her fingers brushed past a leather wallet, a pen, and then something hard encased in cheap plastic. Not his sleek company-issued smartphone. Clara pulled it out. It was a prepaid burner phone. Her breath hitched a tiny involuntary spasm in her chest. Julian was the CEO of a cybersecurity firm. He loathed unsecured devices. The screen was dark, but as she pressed her thumb against the power button, it lit up. No passcode. Just a lock screen featuring a generic mountain landscape and one unread notification hanging in the center like a digital guillotine. The lawyers finalize the restructuring drafts. You get 80%. She gets bought out at a fraction before the IPO. See you at the Fairmont at midnight, my love. Wear the tie I bought you. The atrium around Clara seemed to plunge underwater. The dull roar of conversation, the clinking of crystal, the jazz quartet playing softly in the corner, it all became a distant, muffled hum. Elena, the vice president of strategy, the woman who had been at their dining table 3 nights ago, complimenting Clara's risotto, kissing her cheek upon leaving. Clara stared at the glowing pixels. A betrayal of the flesh was a cliché, a painful, humiliating one, but a cliché nonetheless. Men with too much money and too much ego often strayed, but the words on the screen meant something far more sinister. She gets bought out at a fraction. They weren't just sleeping together, they were meticulously dissecting her life, preparing to carve her out of the empire she had helped build from the ground up in their cramped apartment 7 years ago. They were plotting her financial execution. Slowly, the numbness in her fingertips was replaced by a cold, terrifying clarity. Clara slipped the burner phone back into the inner pocket exactly as she had found it. She smoothed the lapel of the jacket, thanked the attendant with a flawless smile, and walked back into the glittering crowd. She found her spot near the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the rain streak down the glass. Across the room, Julian caught her eye and raised his glass to her, mouthing, "I love you." A few feet away from him stood Elena, sleek and predatory, in a silver gown sipping a Pinot Noir. Clara did not scream. She did not march over and throw her drink in his face. Instead, she raised her empty hand in a graceful, silent toast back to her husband. If Julian wanted her erased, she would oblige him. But she would be the one to orchestrate the vanishing. The walls of the Lake Washington house were made almost entirely of floor-to-ceiling glass designed to invite the natural world in. Lately to Clara, it felt more like a terrarium. a transparent cage where she was expected to perform the role of the blissfully ignorant spouse. It had been 3 weeks since the gala, 21 days of pouring his morning dark roast, of adjusting his silk ties, of listening to him complain about the grueling final stages of the IPO. 21 nights of lying completely still in their king-size bed, listening to the rhythmic, unburdened breathing of a man who firmly believed he had outsmarted her. On a dreary Tuesday morning, after Julian's Tesla glided silently out of the sweeping driveway toward his downtown Seattle headquarters, Clara went to work. She didn't pack bags. She didn't call her sister in New York to weep. Instead, she booted up an encrypted laptop she had purchased with cash at a quiet strip mall in Bellevue. With the surgical precision of the former financial analyst she was, Clara began siphoning funds from their joint offshore accounts. Not large alarm-triggering sums, just steady, undetectable bleeds routed through a labyrinth of shell corporations she had quietly registered under a variation of her maiden name, protected by layers of secure VPNs. Julian and Elena thought they were carving her out of the company's future equity, but Clara was quietly draining the hidden liquidity Julian relied upon to cover his personal, highly leveraged tech investments. Closing the laptop, she walked into Julian's meticulously organized walk-in closet. The scent of his cedarwood cologne hung heavy in the air, a fragrance that once brought her immense comfort, but now made her stomach turn. She bypassed the bespoke suits and reached for a heavy cashmere sweater he rarely wore, shoved toward the back shelf. With a pair of small sewing scissors, Clara carefully snipped a jagged line near the collar, pulling the threads until it looked violently torn rather than cleanly cut. She didn't stop there. Walking into the master bathroom, she opened the bottom drawer of her vanity and retrieved a sterile medical lancet. She pricked her index finger, watching a dark crimson bead well up against her pale skin. Methodically, she pressed the droplet onto the frayed edge of the cashmere, then smeared another faint streak across the pristine white baseboard near the bedroom door. It was incredibly subtle, almost imperceptible unless someone was actively looking for signs of a struggle. A narrative needs a foundation, she thought, pressing an alcohol pad to her finger. And Julian is so very obsessed with controlling the narrative. The psychological toll of her silence, however, was a heavy, suffocating weight. Every time Julian kissed her forehead, she had to physically suppress a shudder. When she caught him texting under the dining table, his thumbs moving rapidly, a faint indulgent smile playing on his lips, the urge to shatter her crystal wine glass against the granite island was nearly overwhelming. The corrosion of her own morality frightened her, but the betrayal anchored her to her purpose. That evening, when Julian returned home, the kitchen smelled warmly of roasting garlic and rosemary. Clara stood by the stove, her posture relaxed. "God, it smells incredible in here," Julian said, wrapping his arms around her waist from behind. He pressed a kiss to her neck. "Long day. Elena is driving me insane with these SEC filings. The board is breathing down my neck." Clara closed her eyes, leaning back into his embrace, feeling the solid warmth of his chest against her spine. The lie rolled off his tongue so effortlessly, so perfectly smooth. "Just a few more weeks, darling," Clara murmured, turning her head to offer him a gentle, practiced smile. "Then everything will change. I promise." He smiled back, completely blind to the ghost she was already becoming. The digital clock on the mahogany nightstand glowed a pale, icy blue 2:14 a.m. Outside, the relentless Seattle rain lashed against the bedroom's floor-to-ceiling windows, blurring the distant twinkling lights of the city skyline across the dark water. In the center of the California king bed, Julian was completely motionless. The half-dose of prescription Ambien Clara had gently suggested he take to calm his pre-IPO jitters had pulled him into a deep, heavy slumber. He was dreaming undoubtedly of the opening bell at the NASDAQ, of Elena standing off-camera, of the billions that awaited him at dawn. Clara stood at the foot of the bed, fully dressed in nondescript dark clothing she had purchased with cash at a thrift store 3 towns over. She watched his chest rise and fall for a long, silent minute. There was no sadness left. The betrayal had burned hot for weeks, but now only cold ash remained. She turned and walked out of the master suite, her footsteps completely silent on the plush carpet. Downstairs in the vast open-concept living room, the real work began. Clara moved with the precise, unhurried grace of a ghost haunting her own life. She approached the heavy oak-end table near the leather sofa and shoved it hard. It toppled over with a dull thud, spilling a stack of glossy, architectural magazines and a heavy brass lamp across the Persian rug. Next, she walked into the kitchen. She took a delicate Riedel crystal wine glass from the rack, wrapped it in a thick dish towel to muffle the sound, and struck it against the edge of the granite island. It shattered inward. She carefully scattered the sharp, glittering shards across the hardwood floor near the hallway, ensuring one jagged piece was stained with a single drop of her own blood harvested from a fresh prick of her lancet. She left her cracked iPhone on the kitchen counter, angled haphazardly, as if it had been dropped in a panic. Next to the sink, resting on a damp paper towel, lay her 3-carat diamond engagement ring. Her final touch was the patio door leading out to the private dock. She slid it open just a fraction, leaving a 5-inch gap. The biting November wind immediately rushed into the warm house, carrying the scent of wet pine and dark lake water, violently rustling the sheer linen curtains. Beside the door frame, she placed one of her favorite black stilettos, tipped on its side. Clara did not look back. She slipped out through the garage side door, pulling the hood of her rain jacket over her hair, and began the 2-mile walk in the freezing downpour to where a used, untraceable sedan was waiting in a commuter lot. 5 hours later, the alarm on Julian's nightstand began to blare. He groaned, reaching out a hand to silence it, expecting to brush against Clara's shoulder. He found only cold, empty sheets. "Clara," he mumbled, his voice thick with sleep. He rubbed his eyes, sitting up. The house was freezing. The ambient heating system was supposed to keep the mansion at a steady 70 degrees, but the air in the bedroom felt like a wind tunnel. "Clara, are you making coffee?" he called out, pushing the duvet aside. He grabbed his robe and walked out onto the landing. The silence that answered him was profound, broken only by the rhythmic flapping of the curtains downstairs. Julian descended the glass staircase, his irritation shifting into a vague, crawling unease. He saw the overturned table first, then the shattered crystal gleaming ominously on the floor. He froze. His bare foot was inches from the glass. "Clara!" he yelled, panic finally piercing the lingering fog of the ambient. He rushed toward the kitchen, his eyes darting frantically. He saw her phone. He saw the ring. He saw the open door leading to the churning, black water of the lake. Julian Vance collapsed to his knees, his hands trembling violently as he reached for the landline on the wall. He did not know it yet, but the empire he was supposed to inherit today had already burned to the ground. The police sirens were just the beginning of the ashes. The NASDAQ ticker running along the bottom of the 60-inch plasma screen in Julian's downtown office was a relentless stream of bleeding red. A week ago, this corner suite overlooking the Puget Sound was supposed to be the command center of his coronation. Now it felt like a glass bunker. Julian sat frozen behind his custom walnut desk, his eyes bloodshot and sunken. He hadn't changed his dress shirt in 2 days. The air in the room was stale thick, with the smell of cold espresso and his own nervous sweat. Outside the building, 3 floors down, news vans were parked on the rain-slicked pavement in a predatory semicircle. The media had already convicted him. The heavy glass door clicked open, and Elena slipped inside immediately, twisting the wand on the window blinds to snap them shut. She wore a severe charcoal blazer, her dark hair pulled back in a tight, unforgiving knot. The intoxicating, conspiratorial warmth that usually radiated between them was entirely gone, replaced by a brittle, terrified distance. "The board just held an emergency session," Elena said, her voice a hushed, flat whisper. She didn't walk toward his desk. She stayed near the door, her arms crossed defensively over her chest. "They want you to take an indefinite leave of absence, effective immediately." Julian slowly dragged his gaze away from the plunging stock numbers. "They can't do that. It's my company. I built this." "You are a liability, Julian," she snapped, the flawless facade of the supportive partner finally cracking. "Detective Miller was at my apartment this morning. They asked me exactly where I was on the night of the gala. They asked me about the corporate restructuring drafts." Julian's stomach plummeted, a cold, sharp dread pooling in his gut. "What did you tell them?" "I told them it was standard business procedure," Elena replied, her eyes darting nervously toward the corners of the ceiling as if Clara's ghost were hiding in the shadows, recording every syllable. "But they are looking for a financial motive, Julian. They found blood on the baseboards. They found your torn cashmere sweater, and now they are threatening to subpoena your personal financial records. If they piece together that we were trying to dilute Clara's shares before you filed for divorce—" "I didn't touch her," Julian said, his voice breaking a desperate plea for her to believe him. "I swear to God, Elena, I took the Ambien. I woke up and she was just gone. It's a setup." Elena looked at him, and for the first time since their illicit hotel meetings began, Julian saw genuine, unfiltered doubt flickering in her dark eyes. The magnetic pull of his power, his wealth, his untouchable confidence. It had all vanished, leaving only the horrifying reality of a prime suspect in a homicide investigation. "It doesn't matter what I believe," Elena said, her voice turning to ice. She finally took a step backward, her manicured hand reaching blindly for the heavy brass doorknob. "It matters what the district attorney can prove. I have my own career to protect. I cannot be dragged down in your undertow." "Elena, please." But she was already slipping out the door, abandoning him to the wolves. The silence of the office rushed back in, heavier and more suffocating than before. Julian stared at the empty space where she had just stood, the devastating truth finally settling over his shoulders. Clara hadn't just vanished. She had orchestrated his execution. And as the red numbers on the ticker continued their terminal silent dive, Julian realized he was entirely alone in a grave he had helped dig. The rhythmic metallic shriek of the Chicago L train rattled the frosted window pane of the third-floor walk-up. It was a bleak February evening, the kind of cold that seeped through the poorly insulated walls and settled deep into the marrow. Clara sat at a chipped Formica dining table wrapped in a heavy charcoal gray wool sweater that smelled faintly of a thrift store. There was no midnight blue silk here, no crystal flutes or imported orchids. Just a mug of bitter, lukewarm black tea and the harsh, sterile glow of a burner laptop illuminating the hollow contours of her face. 3 years of playing a ghost had exacted a terrifying physical and psychological toll. The vengeance that had once burned so brightly in her chest, fueling her escape, had slowly hardened into a heavy, suffocating block of ice. She stared at the screen, scrolling through a niche Seattle business blog. She did this every Tuesday and Friday, a masochistic ritual to ensure the grave she dug for Julian remained sealed. He had never been indicted. Without a body and with a defense attorney who had systematically bled Julian's remaining personal assets dry to establish reasonable doubt, the district attorney had eventually backed away. But the court of public opinion had delivered the execution Clara designed. Julian's unicorn tech firm had collapsed, absorbed by a rival, at a humiliating fraction of its IPO valuation. He had been cast out of the high society galas, blacklisted by venture capitalists, and forced out of the glass mansion on Lake Washington. For a long time, that had been enough. Clara had lived quietly under the name Sarah Juarez, working remote data entry, letting the silence of her new life serve as a monument to her victory. But tonight, the screen showed something different. It was a small, unglamorous article tucked into the back pages of the site. Vance's quiet return, a second act in the shadows below. Headline was a grainy, candid photograph taken outside a drab brick office building in South Seattle. Julian was in the frame, looking 10 years older, the boyish charm replaced by a gaunt, hardened exhaustion. Standing beside him, holding a stack of files, was Elena. Her silver gowns were gone, replaced by a practical, off-the-rack trench coat. They looked battered, stripped of their former glory, yet they were standing together. They were trying to launch a modest, low-level cybersecurity consultancy. Clara's hand trembled slightly as she reached out, her fingertips hovering inches from Elena's digitized face. They had survived her. They were crawling out of the wreckage, holding on to each other in the dark, finding a way to exist in the ruin she had created. The realization hit Clara with the force of a physical blow. The crushing loneliness of her Chicago apartment closed in on her, mocking her. She had sacrificed her name, her home, her entire existence. And for what? To watch them build a life anyway. The moral decay of her lie whispered in the back of her mind. She had become nothing more than an observer, a phantom trapped in purgatory, while the people who betrayed her slowly marched back toward the land of the living. Clara slowly closed the laptop, the sudden darkness reflecting her pale spectral face in the glass screen. The silence of the apartment was unbearable. The ice in her chest cracked, giving way to a new terrifying resolve. The ghost was tired of haunting from afar. It was time to resurrect Clara Vance. The modest half-carat diamond on Elena's left hand caught the dim light of the downtown Seattle bistro. It was a Tuesday evening, and they were celebrating quietly. A small local business journal had just agreed to run a piece on their new cybersecurity consultancy, framing it as a story of redemption and resilience. For the first time in 3 years, Julian felt the agonizing weight of public pariahdom begin to lift from his shoulders. He reached across the linen tablecloth, his fingers brushing against Elena's. Then his phone vibrated against the dark wood. The caller ID displayed a number he hadn't seen in 36 months. Detective Miller, Seattle PD. Julian's breath hitched. He answered the ambient noise of clinking silverware and low jazz fading into a static buzz. When he ended the call a minute later, the blood had drained from his face, leaving his skin the color of old parchment. Julian, Elena whispered, her hand instinctively curling into a fist. What is it? They found her, Binir. He said the words tasting like ash. She's at Harborview Medical Center. By the time Julian's bruised sedan pulled up to the hospital's emergency entrance, the scene was already pure chaos. Clara had ensured her reappearance was anything but quiet. News vans were double parked along the rain-slicked curb, their satellite dishes raised like metallic spears against the night sky. The blinding rapid-fire pop of camera flashes strobed through the steady drizzle as Julian stepped out of the car, leaving Elena hidden in the passenger seat. Microphones were thrust into his face, reporters shouting questions that blurred into a deafening roar. Is it a miracle, Julian? Did you know she was alive? Where has she been? He pushed past the barricades, his heart hammering a frantic, terrifying rhythm against his ribs. Inside the sterile, fluorescent-lit corridors, Detective Miller waited outside a private observation room. The detective's eyes, once filled with hardened suspicion toward Julian, now held a strange mixture of pity and bewilderment. She wandered into a diner near the Canadian border. About 10 hours ago, Miller said in a low voice, handing Julian a plastic visitor's badge. No ID, severe malnutrition. She claims she doesn't know where she's been or what year it is. The only thing she remembered was your name, Julian. Julian felt a cold sweat prickle at the back of his neck. He turned the brass doorknob, the mechanism painfully loud in the quiet hallway, and stepped inside. Clara sat near the edge of a stark white hospital bed, enveloped in a faded, oversized institutional gown. The physical transformation was jarring. Her hair, once styled in sleek, expensive blowouts, hung in uneven, lifeless waves past her shoulders. The hollows of her cheeks were pronounced, and her pale skin seemed almost translucent under the harsh lights. She looked entirely broken. She looked exactly like a woman who had survived a 3-year nightmare. Julian stood frozen by the door, his mind violently rejecting the reality before him. He knew she had staged the blood. He knew she had planted the burner phone. And yet, looking at her now, he felt an icy, paralyzing terror. She wasn't a ghost anymore. She was a living, breathing weapon aimed directly at his chest. Clara slowly lifted her head, her eyes wide and swimming with meticulously summoned tears locked onto his. She let the silence stretch, allowing the crushing weight of her presence to suffocate him completely. Then her lower lip trembled. She reached out a frail, shaking hand toward him, her voice a fragile, broken whisper that was perfectly pitched to carry to the detectives waiting just outside the cracked door. Julian, she breathed a masterclass in manufactured relief. You finally found me. Behind her tear-filled eyes, the cold, calculating architect of his destruction watched the last pillars of his sanity crumble. The trap had closed. The Seattle Police Department had insisted on securing a private top-floor suite at the Fairmont Olympic for the miraculously returned Clara Vance and her husband. It was a gesture of protection from the rabid press pool swarming the lobby downstairs. The heavy mahogany door clicked shut, the heavy brass lock sliding into place with a definitive metallic thud. Detective Miller's heavy footsteps faded down the carpeted hallway, leaving the suite submerged in a thick, ringing silence. The room smelled of expensive linen and complimentary lavender, a stark contrast to the sterile bite of the hospital. Julian stood near the velvet drapes, his hands shoved deep into his pockets to hide their violent trembling. He watched Clara, who sat hunched on the edge of the king-size bed in her borrowed, oversized hospital cardigan. She looked frail, broken, staring blankly at the intricate pattern of the Persian rug. He took a slow, shallow breath, preparing to speak, to ask the lie he was forced to perform. What happened to you, Clara? But before the first syllable could leave his throat, the performance ended. Julian watched in muted horror as the trembling in Clara's shoulders ceased entirely. Her spine straightened vertebrae by rigid vertebrae until she sat with the impeccable, commanding posture she had always maintained at board dinners. She reached a steady hand up to push the lifeless, tangled hair away from her face. When she lifted her gaze to meet his, the vacant, traumatized stare was gone. In its place was a sharp, calculating clarity that froze the blood in Julian's veins. "You can stop sweating, Julian," Clara said. Her voice was no longer a fragile, breathless whisper. It was a low, perfectly modulated hum of authority. "The police aren't listening anymore." Julian took a staggered step backward, hitting the edge of a glass coffee table. "Clara, what are you—" "I know about the burner phone," she interrupted smoothly, standing up. She didn't walk toward him. She moved to the wet bar, her movements unhurried. "I know about the restructuring drafts you and Elena finalized 3 years ago. I know you plan to dilute my founding shares to a fraction of a percent before filing for divorce." Julian's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The air in the suite suddenly felt too thin to breathe. He was staring at a ghost who had meticulously planned her own haunting. "You didn't really think I would let you execute me financially and just walk away, did you?" Clara asked, picking up a crystal tumbler. She poured herself 2 fingers of sparkling water, the quiet fizzing sound echoing in the massive room. "For 3 years I've had access to the offshore accounts you hid from the SEC, the ones you used to leverage the initial seed money for your new consultancy with Elena. I have the digital trail, Julian. Every forged signature, every wire transfer, all neatly compiled on a server that I can make public with a single keystroke." She turned to face him, leaning casually against the marble counter, holding her glass. "You're insane," Julian finally choked out, his voice cracking under the weight of sheer terror. "If you reveal that you'll go to prison for faking your death, for framing me." Clara smiled, a cold, terrifying curving of her lips that didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, Julian, look at me. I am a severely traumatized woman who was held captive, suffering from dissociative amnesia. The district attorney will pity me. The media will canonize me. But you are the disgraced tech bro who tried to steal his wife's fortune and got caught committing federal wire fraud." She set the crystal glass down with a soft, definitive clink. "Here is your choice." She whispered, the quiet words hitting him like physical blows. "Tomorrow at 9 o'clock, you will call your lawyers. You will sign over 100% of your new company, your remaining liquid assets, and your intellectual property to me. You will walk away with nothing, not even Elena, because she will never marry a bankrupt man." Julian shook his head frantically, his chest heaving. "And if I refuse—" "If you refuse, I give the flash drive to Detective Miller, and you spend the next 20 years in a federal penitentiary." Clara's eyes were dead devoid of the woman who had once loved him. "Checkmate, my love. Let me know what you decide by morning." The ink on the final settlement papers and bars had been dry for 6 months. Julian had chosen survival over federal prison, signing away his equity, his intellectual property, and his newly rebuilt firm with a shaking, defeated hand. Exactly as Clara had predicted, Elena's fierce loyalty did not extend to a man permanently stripped of his capital and reputation. She had quietly packed her apartment and accepted a lateral position in Silicon Valley within the week, leaving Julian to face his absolute unmitigated ruin entirely alone. Clara stood in the center of the Lake Washington mansion. She had bought it back through a proxy LLC, paying a premium to restore the custom furniture to the exact positions it had held on the night she vanished. The sweeping floor-to-ceiling glass walls still framed the relentless Seattle rain, gray and heavy over the dark churning water. She wore a tailored white silk blazer, a sharp, deliberate contrast to the drab, oversized sweaters of her Chicago exile, and held a crystal flute of vintage champagne. It was the absolute picture of untouchable triumph. She had successfully orchestrated the flawless destruction of the man who tried to erase her. She had reclaimed her wealth, her power, and her narrative without spending a single day in a courtroom. Yet as she took a slow sip, the champagne tasted like cold metal. The silence in the vast house was no longer a temporary absence of noise. It was a permanent, suffocating entity. Clara walked slowly toward the kitchen, her heels clicking sharply against the polished hardwood. She paused near the granite island, her eyes drifting downward to the exact spot where she had shattered the wine glass 3.5 years ago. The pristine baseboard had been completely replaced. The microscopic stain of her own blood sanded away and painted over by contractors, but Clara could still see it. She realized with a quiet, terrifying clarity that the blood she had willingly spilled that night was the last piece of her own humanity. The woman who had loved Julian Vance, the woman who had helped build a tech empire from a cramped apartment with nothing but ambition and devotion, was dead. She had truly murdered her that night. In her place stood a brilliant, ruthless architect of ruin, a woman who had spent so long playing a ghost in the shadows that she no longer knew how to exist in the light. She had no friends. She hadn't lied to no family. She hadn't manipulated with her meticulously manufactured trauma, and absolutely no capacity left to ever trust another human being. Clara walked to the heavy glass patio door and slid it open just a fraction. The biting damp wind rushed in from the lake, violently rustling the sheer linen curtains exactly as it had on the night of her disappearance. She stepped out onto the wet cedar deck, letting the freezing rain soak into the shoulders of her immaculate blazer. She had won the war. Julian was a broken, forgotten man living in the shadows, and she was the undisputed queen of the empire. But as she looked out over the black water, Clara Vance finally understood the irreversible price of her vengeance. She had built the perfect trap only to realize she was the one locked inside it.